Hi everybody, welcome to Reading with Leon. We are going to read Cathy and Company and Hank the Horse by Alice Schertle and illustrated by Cathy Pavia. I've never read this before, so at least I don't think so. It'll be fun to read. And right there it has Cathy and Company, private clubhouse, members only, Cathy, Lou, Joey. There's a picture there. I guess that's everybody in the family, maybe? Cathy rubbed an ice cube across her forehead. "It's going to be a hot summer," she said. Cathy was president of Cathy and Company because the clubhouse was in her yard. Lou was the tall member. He was poking Joey, and Joey was the short member. He was punching Lou. Dot was the red-haired member. She was practicing handstands in the corner of the clubhouse. Cathy's dog Dumpling was curled up on the rug. Cathy dropped the ice cubes into a glass. She held up her hand for silence. "There's something outside. Listen." The clubhouse grew very quiet. Everyone looked at Cathy. "I mean it," Cathy whispered. "There's something in the yard. Something big." She looked out toward the window. Outside, they heard a snorting and a puffing sound. Something brushed up against the wall of the clubhouse, and the whole clubhouse shook. The hair on Dumpling's neck stood straight up. A low growl rumbled in her throat. Lou got slowly to his feet. He stood half crouched in the middle of the floor. "Zonkers," he said. "What is it?" Joey scooted behind Lou. "Go look out the window," he whispered. He gave Lou a little push. "Yeah," Dot hissed. "See what it is, Lou." She gave him a little shove. Lou dug his heels into the floor. "Nuts to that. You look, Cathy. You're the president. Besides, it's your yard." Outside, a branch snapped crack. Then came the sound of slow, steady munching. Cathy took a deep breath. She tiptoed across the floor. Excuse me. At almost the same moment, a gigantic head poked through the window. Two huge brown eyes stared at Cathy. Cathy gave a little scream. "Ah!" Behind her, Lou and Joey and Dot cried, "A horse!" At the sound of Cathy's scream, the horse's eyes flew wide open. He tossed his head up with a startled snort and backed away from the clubhouse. Cathy and Company hurried outside. In the corner of the yard stood a big gray horse. There were stickers caught in his mane and his tail, and long whiskers grew out of his chin. Dried mud clung to his shaggy hair around his hooves. There's the picture of the horse. "Where did he come from?" cried Joey. "There aren't any horses around here. This is the middle of town." Lou poked Joey. "Maybe it's just a big dog, Squirt." "I don't think that looks like a dog." Cathy held out her hand and walked across the lawn. She patted the big gray neck, and a little puff of dust rose in the air. The horse lifted his shaggy head and gazed over Cathy's shoulder. What a faraway look in his eyes, Cathy thought. Like he sees something that no one else can see. Aloud, she said, "What are you thinking about, big fella? And where did you come from?" The back door banged open and Cathy's mother hurried across the lawn. "Merciful heavens," she said. "A horse?" Cathy nodded. "Isn't he a beauty?" Her mother smiled and patted the horse's back. A puff of dust rose in the air. "Well," she said, "he certainly seems like a nice old fellow. He has lovely, gentle eyes. Wherever do you suppose he came from?" Lou said, "How about the riding stables out on River Drive? Maybe he's one of the horses they use for riding lessons." "We'd better take him out there," said Dot. "Somebody's probably worried about him." "Let's see if he'll let you lead him," said Cathy's mother. "We want to make sure he's gentle." Half an hour later, Cathy and company led the old gray horse down the street. Cathy held the end of a piece of rope. The other end was tied around the horse's neck. Dot was wearing a cowboy hat and a checkered bandana. A tin star was pinned to her shirt. People stared and pointed out their windows. Shopkeepers came to their driveways to watch them go past. Drivers of cars smiled and waved. "Everybody's watching us," said Joey. Cathy grinned. Dot began to whistle, "Home on the Range." Lou did his best to walk like a bow-legged cowboy. No one at the River Drive stables knew the big gray horse. "You might go up to Sycamore Heights," a man told Cathy. "A few people still have horses on Apple Road." They were several blocks away from the stables when the old horse began to pull on the rope. "He wants to go this way," said Cathy. "You suppose he lives on this street?" "How could he?" Dot asked. "There's nothing but houses and apartments, and the high school." The old horse stopped right outside the high school field. He put his nose against the wire fence and nickered softly. And Lou scratched his head. "What's the matter with him? He wants to go to high school?" Cathy and the company led the horse onto the football field. At once the old horse dropped his head to the ground and began to graze. Lou laughed. He just wanted some nice green grass. Maybe he thought this was a horse pasture. Joey said, "I love the sound he makes when he chews." "What's that old nag doing here?" said a loud voice. 4 big boys walked onto the field. They wore t-shirts with Lincoln High printed on them. A boy with long blonde hair tossed a football into the air and caught it. There's Cathy and company, and that looks like the tall football player they talked about. The blonde boy walked up to Cathy. "Hey, kid, better get that old nag out of here. We're going to play football." Cathy frowned, but she didn't say anything. She pulled on the rope. The old gray horse wouldn't budge. The blonde boy tossed the football to one of his friends and walked up to the horse. He shook his head. "What a bag of bones. Come on, kids, move that old flea bag out of here." Cathy glared at the boy. "He's not a flea bag," she snapped. "If anybody has fleas around here, it's you." The big boy flipped the blonde hair out of his eyes. He took a step towards Cathy. "Oh, yeah?" he growled. "Hey, Jess, heads up," yelled one of the other boys. The football sailed through the air, and the blonde boy dashed across the field and made a flying catch. "Let's get out of here," Lou muttered. He and Dot took a hold of the rope, and they helped Cathy pull the old horse off the field. Out on the sidewalk, the gray horse turned and gazed back at the field. Cathy saw a faraway look in his eyes. She gently rubbed the long gray face. "Come on, big fellow, let's go find your home." When Cathy and company reached Sycamore Heights, they took Apple Road up into the hills. The old gray hung his head from side to side, sniffing the breeze. Now and then he let out a loud whinny. "He knows this place," said Dot. They came to a house with a small corral in the front yard, but leafy rows of vegetables filled the corral. "Looks like they used to keep horses here," said Lou. "Maybe they know where this guy belongs." Cathy walked up to the porch and rang the bell. A fat man opened the door "We found a horse," said Cathy. "Do you know where he lives?" "So," said the man, "Mrs. Minnie's old Hank got out again." He pointed down the road, around one more bend. "Little blue house with a peach tree in front. Mrs. Minnie will be home writing. That's how she earns her living." That's a nice man to tell her where the horse belongs. Around a bend in the road, Cathy and company came to a little blue house with a peach tree in front. When they were halfway down the driveway, the front door flew open with a bang. A white-haired lady hurried down the porch steps. Her hair was cut very short, and a pair of glasses was pushed up on her head. There was a pencil behind her ear. The old lady walked right up to the horse and shook her finger in front of his face. "Hank," she cried, "where in tarnation have you been?" The old horse pushed his nose against the lady. She had to take a step backwards to keep from being knocked over. Cathy tried to push the horse away, but the old lady just laughed. She pulled fondly at the horse's ears. "You old rascal," she said. Then she turned to Cathy and company. "So you found him, eh?" "Yes, ma'am," said Cathy. She introduced herself. Then she introduced Lou and Joey and Dot. The old lady solemnly shook hands with each one of them. "Folks call me Miss Minnie. I'm Minnie Wiggins," she said. "And I thank you for returning Hank, the old scamp." Cathy and company followed Mrs. Minnie around the back of the house. They led Hank into a old wooden corral and untied the rope. Cathy ran her hand along the top rail of the corral. There were deep grooves in the wood, as if a giant had taken big bites out of the rail. "That's Hank's work," said Miss Minnie. "He's a cribber nowadays." Cathy looked puzzled. "Cribber?" "He chews wood," Mrs. Minnie explained. "Does it 'cause he's bored. That's why he runs off, too." She sighed. "A horse needs exercise. He needs wide open spaces, a place where he can run, fresh grass to graze on." The old lady swept her arm around in a circle. "Used to be like that in these hills. Now there are houses on all the fields, streets where the horse trails used to be." Cathy looked at the old gray horse. He was standing in a corner of the corral. His head hung down and his eyes were half closed. Now and then his tail flicked at a fly. There's Cathy talking to Mrs. Wiggins, and you can see the mark where Hank was chewing on the wood. Miss Minnie sighed again. "You never know it now, but Hank was a fine-looking horse in his day, smooth and sleek like a seal. Now he needs grooming and he needs exercise." She fingered the pencil behind her ear. "My writing just keeps me too busy nowadays." "Mrs. Minnie," Cathy asked shyly, "could we come back again and see Hank?" Joey nodded eagerly. "Maybe we could help take care of him." "It's summer vacation," Dot said. "We could come almost every day." "We could take him on walks," said Lou, "so he wouldn't want to run away all the time." Mrs. Minnie laughed. "Looks like Hank found some friends." That was the first of many summer days Cathy and company spent at the little blue house on Apple Road. Hank whinnied a greeting whenever he heard them on the gravel driveway. "We want to learn all about horses," Cathy told Mrs. Minnie. "We want to take care of Hank." Mrs. Minnie showed them how to groom Hank's coat. They scraped off the dirt and the long loose hair with a round metal curry comb. Then they wiped off the dust with a soft brush Mrs. Minnie called a dandy. Before they were through, Joey's arm began to ache. "I didn't know horses were so big," he moaned. Mrs. Minnie looked at the piles of gray hair that fell on the ground. She shook her head. Old Hank really needs a grooming. I just can't give him the time he needs. Maybe folks are right. Maybe I should." Mrs. Minnie didn't finish. She went into the house muttering to herself. "Sounds really sad." Cathy and company groomed Hank almost every day. As the weeks went by, the old horse began to change. His long shaggy coat became short and smooth and even began to shine a little. They pulled the stickers out of his mane and his tail and learned to pick up his feet and clean out the mud and the pebbles with the hoof pick. Mrs. Minnie showed them how to put a bridle on the old horse, and soon they were riding Hank up and down Apple Road. Sometimes Mrs. Minnie brought out a picture lemonade. Then Cathy and company would join her on the back porch and listen to her talk about horses. Always remember, said the old lady with a brisk nod, a horse will act pretty much the way you act. If you're gentle, he's gentle. If you're mean, so's he. If you're calm, he's calm. If you're jumpy, you've got a jumpy horse on your hands. One day, Cathy mentioned the faraway look in Hank's eyes. Like he sees something no one else can see, she said. Miss Minnie sat quietly for a long time. Finally, she said, So you see that look too, do you? When old Hank looks like that, I always imagine he's thinking about running free someplace. A horse needs a place to run. Not good for Hank to be cooped up. Mrs. Minnie closed her eyes and sighed. We'll exercise him, Cathy said quickly. We'll take him out right now. I get to ride first today, Joey shouted as they ran out to the corral. Cathy lifted the leather bridle to Hank's head the way Miss Minnie had showed her. Carefully, she slipped a bit into his mouth. Lou reached up and pulled the leather straps over Hank's ears. Then he gave Joey a boost onto the broad, square back. Try not to fall off now, Squirt, Lou said. Fall off? Joey looked insulted. I never fall off. He gave Hank's sides a good nudge with his heels. Get up, boy. The old horse plodded off down the road. They headed up into the hills. The houses they passed were big. Some had views of the whole city below. As they turned a corner, Hank began to walk faster. Hey, Joey, Dot said, wait up. Not so fast, Squirt, Lou complained. Hank broke into a trot. Whoa, boy, Cathy yelled. Slow down. She grabbed Joey's leg. What are you trying to do? Shouted Joey. Pull me off? He jerked his leg out of Cathy's hand. There they are, riding. I think Hank wants to run free. What do you guys think? Don't kick Hank, Dot shouted. That makes him go. Cathy and company raced down the street after Joey and Hank. The old horse headed straight for a big brick house. It had a large lawn in front, but a bright flower bordered the lawn. Hank ran into the front yard and put his head down. His teeth tore big hunks of grass out of the lawn. Joey flapped the reins. Cut that out, Hank, he yelled. The big horse jogged off to the other side of the yard. The ground was wet. Hank's hoofs made deep holes in the lawn. A lady came running out of the brick house. Get that horse off my lawn, she cried. Look what he's doing to my lawn. Joey slipped off of Hank's back. He tugged onto the reins. Let's get out of here, Hank, he begged. Cathy and Lou and Dot ran into the yard. They waved their arms and shouted, Get out of there, Hank. Yee, yee, yee. Move. Hank's head shot up into the air. His eyes flew wide open. He jerked the reins out of Joey's hands and galloped into the flower bed. Hank bit off a big pink flower and began to chew. The lady put her hands to her cheeks. My petunias, she shrieked. She ran across the lawn, flapping her apron. Shoo, shoo. Hank snatched another quick mouthful of flowers. Then he bolted across the lawn and raced down the street with purple and pink petunias hanging out of his mouth. That's so silly. And there's a picture of all of them on Mrs. Minnie's porch. Cathy and company ran after him, yelling, Whoa! It was almost 2 hours later when they brought Hank back to the little blue house. Mrs. Minnie listened quietly while they told her what had happened. Big brick house, hey, she said. That would be Mrs. King's. Hank ate her petunias? I'll have to phone and apologize for that. I kicked Hank, Joey said miserably. It's my fault. I grabbed you and yelled, said Cathy. It's my fault, too. Dot looked down at her shoes. We all probably scared Hank to death. Mrs. Minnie nodded. A horse acts pretty much the way you act. After a minute, she said, flapped her apron at him, did she? Mrs. Minnie's eyes twinkled. Her mouth twitched. She got up quickly and went into the house. When she came back out, she was carrying a pitcher of lemonade. Old Hank, she said, as she poured out tall glasses. He just couldn't resist that big green lung, that rascal. The next day, Cathy called a special meeting at the clubhouse. And if you guys haven't ever drank bubblers, these are really good. My favorite's the tropical one, but I thought I'd try the Twisted Elixir. Not sponsored at all, just letting you guys know. Cathy banged the hammer on a coffee can. The meeting will come to order. Lou stopped poking Joey. Joey stopped punching Lou. Dot stopped practicing backbends in the corner. This meeting is about Hank, Cathy told them. Summer is almost over, and we won't be able to go up to Sycamore Heights much after school starts. Dot nodded glumly. It's too far. Poor Hank, said Joey. He'll be cooped up every day. Cathy looked from Lou to Dot to Joey. Her eyes were shining with excitement. We might be able to buy Hank from Mrs. Minnie. She said each word slowly and clearly. For a moment there was complete silence in the clubhouse. Then Lou cried, Buy Hank? You mean really buy him? Cathy could hardly sit still. I already talked to my folks about it, and they said they'll talk it over with your folks. They might all help us buy him if we work hard. We'll have to earn money to help pay for his food and everything. I'll chip in my allowance every week, Joey cried. Lou shouted, I'll mow the lawn every day. Dot jumped to her feet. My folks won't have to buy me birthday presents or a Christmas present or anything if they help us buy Hank. Cathy said we can rent a stall for Hank at the River Drive stables. It's close enough to walk there every day, and we can take Hank to visit Mrs. Minnie every Saturday. Joey's smile faded. Mrs. Minnie, she said slowly. Will she sell Hank? She loves him. She knows we love him too, Cathy said. And Mrs. Minnie always says Hank needs more time than she can give him. We'll ask her tomorrow. They set out for Sycamore Heights early the next morning. Lou kept shaking her head and saying, Horse of our own. Zonkers. Dot had her cowboy hat pushed way back on her head. She was singing cowboy songs at the top of her lungs. No one answered when they knocked on the door of the little blue house. Mrs. Minnie is probably out with Hank, Cathy said. They ran around to the back. The corral was empty, and the board that held the gate closed was broken. The gate was wide open. Hank broke the gate. He ran away again. The car is gone too, said Dot. Mrs. Minnie is probably out looking for Hank. Cathy ran into a shed next to the corral. She grabbed Hank's bridle off the wall. Come on, she cried. We've got to find him. They hurried out to the road. Cathy frowned, trying to think. Let's see. Which way would Hank go? There they are. It looks like they're all thinking about which way Hank would go. He'd look for some grass to eat, Joey piped up. He'd find a big lawn somewhere. That's what he always does. Cathy and company checked every house in Sycamore Heights with a big front lawn. Finally, they headed down out of the hills. Dot let her breath out in a long sigh. Hank could be anywhere. He made it all the way to Cathy's house once. Cathy stopped so suddenly that Joey bumped into her. When we brought him back that day, remember where he led us? You don't suppose he'd go back to the high school? Lou's eyes opened wide. Zonkers, this is Saturday. There's a preseason football game today. They had reached the high school field. The game had already started. Crowds of people filled the grandstand. Some people waved red and white pennants that said Lincoln High Lions. Others carried blue pennants that said Wilson Warriors. Cathy and company hurried through the main gate. Cathy's eyes searched the field quickly. Hank's not here. Her shoulders sagged. This place was our last hope. I just don't know where to look next. Let's find a water fountain, said Joey. I'm thirsty. Suddenly, the crowd began to laugh. Ha ha ha. People in the grandstand pointed towards the field. Cathy and company turned to see what was happening. At the far end of the stadium, a big gray horse trotted onto the field. The game stopped. All the players turned to stare at the horse. In the middle of the field, Hank put his head down and began to graze. Lou clutched his head with both hands. Zonkers, the middle of the game? Why couldn't he wait until halftime? Dot began to giggle. Hee hee. The referee blew a long blast on his whistle. He ran towards Hank, waving his handkerchief. The crowd in the grandstand roared with laughter. Ha 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 ha. Hank's head came up with a snort. He galloped across the field. People on the sidelines waved their pennants at him. A cheerleader shook a red and white pom-pom. The old gray horse skidded to a stop. He arched his neck and rolled his eyes. Then he turned and raced back up the field. His mane was flying, and his hoofs pounded the ground. Look at Hank, said Joey. I've never seen him run like that. They're scaring him, cried Cathy. He'll get away again. Oh, look, poor Hank, he's scared. Hank stopped at the far end of the field and he pawed nervously at the ground. Suddenly, one of the football players ran towards him. He was a big boy with long blonde hair hanging out of his helmet. I'll get the old flea bag off the field, the boy shouted. He looked up at the crowd to make sure everyone was watching him. The boy threw the football. He threw it hard. The ball bounced off the ground right in front of the old gray horse. Hank's eyes flew wide open. He reared up on his hind legs. Big front paw legs pawed the air, and he let out a loud, shrill whinny. The crowd fell silent. The big boy stopped in his tracks. He began to back away. Then he turned and ran back to the other players. At that moment, Cathy and Lou and Joey and Dot walked onto the field. Very slowly, they walked up to the big gray horse. No one in the crowd made a sound. People leaned forward in their seats to watch. Cathy held her hand out. Hank didn't move. Cathy spoke to him quietly while she slipped the bit into his mouth. Lou reached up and pulled the leather straps over his ears, and Dot and Joey stroked the horse gently. Easy, boy, said Dot. It's okay, Hank, Joey whispered. Cathy held on to Hank's mane. She eased herself carefully onto the broad gray back. Then she gave Hank a little nudge with her heels. As Cathy and company walked Hank slowly off the field, the crowd began to clap. Some people stood up and cheered. Nice going, kid, someone called out. Ride 'em, cowboy. Cathy grinned. Dot patted Hank's neck. Joey clasped his hands together and shook them over his head. Lou did his best to walk like a bow-legged cowboy. And on the way back to Sycamore Heights, Cathy leaned over and put her arms around Hank's neck. He didn't even try to run away from us. He knows he's our horse. Dot said quietly, we hope he's our horse. Who's going to ask Mrs. Minnie to sell him? Everyone looked at Cathy. When they rounded the bend on Apple Road, they saw Mrs. Minnie in the front yard, and she ran down the driveway to meet them. Hank, she cried, shaking her finger under the horse's nose. I've been driving all over creation looking for you. Where in tarnation have you been? He's been to high school, Cathy said. Yeah, said Lou. Hank tried out for the football team. Mrs. Minnie laughed and laughed when they described Hank's adventure at Lincoln High. Ha ha ha. She looked proudly from Cathy to Joey to Lou to Dot. You did just right, she told him. Old Hank knows he can trust you. The old lady led Hank into his corral and tied the gate shut open with a rope. Then she gave him some hay. Cathy noticed that she gave him more than usual. Mrs. Minnie put her hands on the rail and watched the old horse eat his hay. Her fingers slid into a groove where Hank had chewed the wood. "Let's go inside," Mrs. Minnie said. "It's hot out here, and there's something I want to tell you." "We have something to tell you, too." Oh, and there's Hank back in his corral. "Cathy, we have something to tell you, too," Cathy said happily as they followed her into the house. They sat around a wooden table in the kitchen. "I got a phone call last night," Mrs. Minnie said, as she poured a tall glasses of lemonade. "It was my cousin. He has a ranch way up in Pine Valley. Lots of open meadows and tall green grass. My cousin wants to take Hank up to his ranch." Cathy found it hard to swallow her lemonade. "Take Hank away?" she whispered. "Forever?" Lou asked. Mrs. Minnie nodded. "My cousin's been after me for a long time to let him take Hank. He knows Hank needs a pasture to graze on and a place to run." No one spoke for a minute. Mrs. Minnie stirred the ice cube in her lemonade. "I know you love Hank as I do, and you've taken good care of him all summer. I want you to help me decide. Should I let old rascal go?" Lou and Joey and Dot looked at Cathy. Cathy started to say something, and then she stopped. She cleared her throat and said, "Mrs. Minnie, could Joey and Dot and Lou and I go out and see Hank for a minute?" Cathy and company stood by the corral and looked at the old gray horse. Hank stood with his head down and his eyes half closed. Now and then his tail swished away a fly. Joey smiled. "Remember how Hank looked when he was racing across the football field?" "He was beautiful," Dot said. Lou peeled a splinter off one of the corral posts. "Hank sure likes to run," he said softly. "He likes wide open spaces and green grass." Hank raised his head and gazed out past the corral. There's a picture of Hank running. I wonder if that's his imagination or his new home, if he goes wherever he goes. Cathy saw a faraway look in his eyes, like he sees something no one else can see, she thought. She reached over and rubbed the big gray neck. "I see it too, Hank," she whispered. It was late afternoon when Cathy and company started off for home. A cool breeze had sprung and autumn was in the air. "This has been a good summer," Dot said. "We had a horse to take care of for 3 whole months. And we met Mrs. Minnie," Joey added. "I'm glad she asked us to come back and visit her," Lou said, "even after Hank's gone." At the bend in the road, Cathy turned and looked back. But she didn't really see the little blue house with the peach tree in front. She saw rolling hills and green meadows and an old gray horse running in the wind. Kind of sad, but happy at the same time. I hope you guys enjoyed it. That was actually a really good book. I always wanted to ride horses and stuff, but that's okay. So hope you guys learned a little something about horses and stuff, and hope you guys have an amazing weekend. I think it's supposed to be nice weather, so knock on wood that it'll stay nice. Have a great day. Bye.